Good morning. Page 208. Philosophers, psychologists, medical men and writers could have observed in our camps, as nowhere else, in detail and on a large scale, the special process of the narrowing of the intellectual and spiritual horizons of a human being, the reduction of the human being to an animal, and the process of dying alive. But the psychologists who got into our camps were, for the most part, not up to observing. They themselves had fallen into that very same stream that was dissolving the personality into feces and ash. Just as nothing that contains life can exist without getting rid of its wastes, so the archipelago could not keep swirling about without precipitating to the bottom its principal form of waste, the last Lagers. And everything built by the archipelago had been squeezed out of the muscles of the last Lagers before they became last Lagers, and those who survived, who reproach the last Lagers with being themselves to blame, must take upon themselves the disgrace of their own preserved lives. And among the surviving, the orthodox communists write me lofty protests. How base are the thoughts and feelings of the heroes of your story one day in the life of Ivan Denisovich? Where are their anguished cogitations about the course of history? Everything is about bread rations and gruel, and yet there are sufferings much more unbearable than hunger. Oh, so there are. So there are indeed much more unbearable sufferings, the sufferings of orthodox thought. You in your medical sections in your storerooms, you never knew hunger there, orthodox loyalist gentlemen. It has been known for centuries that hunger rules the world, and all your progressive doctrine is, incidentally, built on hunger, on the thesis that hungry people will inevitably revolt against the well-fed. Hunger rules every human being, unless he himself has consciously decided to die. Hunger, which forces an honest person to reach out and steal, when the belly rumbles, conscience flees. Hunger, which compels the most unselfish person to look with envy into someone else's bowl, and to try painfully to estimate the weight of ration of its neighbor, to estimate what weight of ration his neighbor is receiving. Hunger, which darkens the brain and refuses to allow it to be distracted by anything else at all, or to think about anything else at all, or to speak about anything else at all except food. Hunger from which it is impossible to escape even in dreams. Dreams are about food, and insomnia is over food, and soon just insomnia. Hunger after which one cannot even eat up. The man has by then turned into a one-way pipe, and everything emerges from him in exactly the same state in which it was swallowed. And this too the Russian cinema screen must see, how the last Lagers, jealously watching their competitors out of the corners of their eyes, stand duty at the kitchen porch waiting for them to bring out the slops in the dishwater. How they throw themselves on it and fight with one another, seeking a fish head, a bone, vegetable parings, and how one last Lager dies, killed in that scrimmage, and how immediately afterward they wash off this waste and boil it and eat it, and inquisitive cameramen can continue with their shooting and show us how, in 1947, in Dolinka, Bessarabian peasant women who had been brought in from freedom hurled themselves at that very same intent slops which the last laggards had already checked over. The screen will show bags of bones, which are still joined together, lying under blankets and in the hospital, dying almost without movement, and then being carried out. And on the whole, how simply a human being dies. He was speaking, and he fell silent. He was walking along the road, and he fell down. Shudder, and it's over. How in Camp Unja and Nuksha, the fat-faced, socially friendly worker, a signer jerks a Zek by the legs to get him out to line up, and he turns out to be dead, and the corpse falls on its head on the floor, croaked the scum, and gaily gives him a kick for good measure. At those camps during the war, there was no doctor's aid, not even an orderly. And as a result, there were no sick, and anyone who pretended to be sick was taken out to the woods in his comrade's arms, and they also took aboard a rope along so they could drag the corpse back the more easily. At work, they laid the sick person down next to the bonfire, and it was to the interest of both the Zeks and the convoy to have him die the sooner. What the screen cannot catch will be described to us in slow. The various paths of death. What the screen cannot catch will be described to us in slow, meticulous prose, which will distinguish between the nuances of the various paths of death, which are sometimes called scurvy, sometimes pellagra, sometimes alimentary dystrophy. For instance, if there is blood on your bread after you have taken a bite, that is scurvy. From then on, your teeth begin to fall out, your gums rot, ulcers appear on your legs, your flesh will begin to fall off in whole chunks, and you will begin to smell like a corpse. Your bloated legs collapse. They refuse to take such cases into the hospital, and they crawl on all fours around the camp compound. But if your face grows dark and your skin begins to peel and your entire organism is racked by diarrhea, this is pellagra. It is necessary to halt the diarrhea somehow, so they take 3 spoons of chalk a day, and they say that in this case, if you can get and eat a lot of herring, the food will begin to hold. But where are you going to get herring? The man grows weaker, and the bigger he is, the faster it goes. He has already become so weak that he cannot climb to the top bunks. He cannot step across a log in his path. He has to lift his leg with 2 hands or else crawl on all fours. The diarrhea takes out of a man both strength and all interest in other people, in life, in himself. He grows deaf and stupid, and he loses all capacity to weep, even when he is being dragged along the ground by a sledge. He is no longer afraid of death. He is wrapped in a submissive rosy glow. He has crossed all boundaries and has forgotten the name of his wife, of his children, and finally his own name too. Sometimes the entire body of a man dying of starvation is covered with blue-black pimples like peas, with pus-filled heads smaller than a pinhead. His arms, his face, arms, legs, his trunk, even his scrotum. It is so painful he cannot be touched. The tiny boils come to a head and burst. and a thick worm-like string of pus is forced out of them. The man is rotting alive. If black, astonished headlights are crawling on your face, on the face of your neighbor on the bunks, it is a sure sign of death. By what naturalism? P? Why keep talking about all that? And what is it they usually say today? Those who did not themselves suffer, who were themselves the executioners, or who have washed their hands of it, or who put an innocent expression. Why remember all that? Why rake over old wounds, their wounds? Lev Tolstoy had an answer for that. To Birukov, quote, "What do you mean, why remember? If I have a terrible illness, and I have succeeded in recovering from it and been cleansed of it, I will always remember gladly. The only time I will refuse to remember is when I am still ill and have gotten worse, and when I wish to deceive myself. If we remember the old, and look it straight in the face, then our new and present violence will also disclose itself." Unquote. I want to conclude these pages about the last Lakers with NGK's story about the engineer Lev Nikolaevich Y. Indeed, this must, in view of the first name and patronymic, be in honor of Tolstoy, a last Laker theoretician who found the last Laker's pattern of existence to be the most convenient method of preserving his life. Here is how the engineer Y occupies himself in a remote corner of the camp compound on a hot Sunday. Something with a resemblance to a human being sits in a declivity above a pit in which brown peaty water has collected. Set out around a pit are sardine heads, fish bones, pieces of gristle, crusts of bread, lumps of cooked cereal, wet-washed potato peelings, and something in addition, which is even difficult to name. A tiny bonfire has been built on a piece of tin, and above it hangs a soot-blackened soldier's mess tin containing a broth. It seems to be ready. The last Laker begins to dip out of the dark slops from the mess tin with a wooden spoon and to wash down with them one after another the potato peeling, the gristle, and the sardine head. He keeps chewing away very, very slowly and deliberately. It's the common misfortune of last Lakers to gulp things down hastily without chewing. His nose can hardly be seen in the midst of the dark gray wool that covers his neck, his chin, and his cheeks. His nose and his forehead are a waxy brown color, and in places the skin is peeling. His eyes are teary and blink frequently. Noticing the approach of an outsider, the last Laker quickly gathers up everything set out there which he has not yet eaten, presses his mess tin to his chest, falls to the ground, and curls up in a ball like a hedgehog. And now he can't be beaten, shoved, but he is firmly on the ground. He won't stir. He won't give up his mess tin. NKG speaks to him in a friendly voice, and the hedgehog uncurls a bit. He sees his visitor does not intend to beat him or to take away his mess tin. A conversation ensues. They are both engineers, NG a geologist and Y a chemist. And now Y discloses to G his own fate, basing himself on his still remembered formulas for the chemical composition of substances. He demonstrates that one can get everything nutritionally necessary from refuse. One merely has to overcome one's squeamishness and direct all one's efforts to extracting nourishment from this source. Notwithstanding the heat, Y is dressed in several layers of clothes, all dirty. And he had a basis for this too. Y had established experimentally that lice and fleas will not multiply in extremely dirty clothing, as though they themselves were squeamish. Therefore he had even picked out for one of his undergarments a piece of wiping in the repair shop. Here was how he looked. He wore a maddening helmet with a black candle stump in place of the spiked peak. The helmet was covered with scorch marks, in some places hay, and in some places oakum adhered to the greasy elephant ears of the helmet. From his outer clothing, torn pieces and tatters stuck out like tongues on his back and sides. Patches and patches, a layer of tar on one side. The cotton wool lining was hanging out in a fringe along the hem. Both outer sleeves were torn to the elbows, and when the last lager raised his arms, he looked like a bat, shaking his wings, and on his feet were boat-like rubber shoes, glued together from red automobile tires. Why was he dressed so warmly? In the first place, the summer was short and the winter long, and it was necessary to keep everything he had for the winter, and where else could he keep it except on himself? In second place, the principal reason he created by means of soft, well-padded exterior, and thus did not feel pain when he was struck. He could be kicked and beaten with sticks without getting bruised. This was his one defense. All he had to do was be quick enough to see who was about to strike him, drop to the ground in time, pull his knees up to his stomach, thus covering it, press his head down into his chest, and embrace it with his thickly padded arms. The only places they could hit him were padded, and so that no one should beat him for too long at a time, it was necessary quickly to give the person beating him a feeling of triumph, and to this end Y had learned to howl hideously like a piglet from the very first blow, even though he wasn't hurting in the least. For in camp they are very fond of beating up on the weak, and only the work assigners and brigadiers, not only, but the ordinary sex as well, so as not to feel completely weak themselves. And what was to be done if people simply could not believe in their own strength unless they subjected others to cruelty? And to why this seemed a fully endurable and reasonable chosen way of life, and one, in addition, which did not require him to soil his conscience. He did nobody harm. He hoped to survive his term. The interview with the last laker is over. In our glorious fatherland, which was capable for more than 100 years of not publishing work of Chadayev because of his reactionary views, you see, you are not likely to surprise anyone with the fact that the most important and boldest books are never read by contemporaries. And thus it is that I am writing this book solely from sense of obligation, because too many stories and recollections have accumulated in my hands. And I cannot allow them to perish. I do not expect to see it in print anywhere with my own eyes, and I have little hope that those who manage to drag their bones out of the archipelago will ever read it. and I do not at all believe that it will explain the truth of our history in time for anything to be corrected. In the very heat of working on this book, I was struck by the greatest shock of my life. The dragon emerged for 1 minute, licked up my novel with its wicked rough red tongue, and several older works, and retired behind the curtain for the time. But I can hear him. I can hear him breathing, and I know that his teeth are aimed at my neck. That is just that my time is not up yet. And with devastated soul, I am going to gather my strength to complete this investigation, so that it at least may escape the dragon's teeth. In the days when Shalikov, who had long since ceased to be a writer, journeyed from this country of harried and arrested writers to receive a Nobel Prize, I was trying to duck the dicks, seeking a hiding place and trying to win time for my clandestine, panting pen to complete this very book. I have digressed, but what I wanted to say was that in our time, in our country, the best books remain unknown to their contemporaries, and it is very possible that I am therefore vainly repeating the secret work of someone else when had I known of it. I could have made my own work shorter, but during the 7 years of our frail and pale freedom, some things did nevertheless emerge, despite everything, and one swimmer in the dawn-lit ocean had spied another head and cried out in a wheezy voice to him. And it was in this way that I learned of Shalamov's 60 camp stories, and of his study of the thieves. I wanted to declare here that, apart from several individual points on which we disagree, no difference of interpretation has ever arisen between us in explaining the archipelago. He and I evaluated the whole native thing in the same way. Shalamov's camp experience was more bitter and longer than mine, and I acknowledge with esteem that it fell to him rather than to me to plumb those depths of beastliness and despair to which the whole camp way of life was dragging us all down. This, however, does not prohibit my raising objections to specific points on which we disagree. One such point is the evaluation of the camp medical section. Shalamov speaks with hate and gall, and rightly too, of every camp establishment, but he always makes a biased exception solely for the medical section. He supports, if he does not create a legend about the benign camp medical section, he affirms that everything in the camp was against the camp inmate except the doctor. He alone could help him. That he can help still doesn't mean that he does. He can help if he so desires, just as the construction superintendent, the norm setter, the bookkeeper, the storeroom clerk, the cook, the orderly, and the work assigner can too. But do many of them actually help? Perhaps up to 1932, when the camp medical sections were still subordinate to the People's Commissariat of Health, the doctors could still be doctors. But in 1932, the medical sections were turned over in toto to GULag, and it became their role to help their oppressors and to be grave diggers. So, leaving aside the good cases with good doctors, Just who would have kept those medical sections in the archipelago at all if they had not served the common purpose? When the commandant and the brigadier beat up on the last lager because he refused to go out to work so badly that he was left licking his wounds like a dog and lay unconscious for 2 days in a punishment cell, Babbage, and for 2 months forward could not even crawl down from the bunks. Was it not the medical section at Camp Number 1 at the Dujida group of camps that refused to draw up official certification of the beating and subsequently to treat him? And who was it if not the medical section that signed every decree for imprisonment in the punishment block? Incidentally, let us not lose sight of the fact that the chiefs did not have all that great need for that doctor's signature. In the camp near the Indigirka, S.A. Chapatyara was a free plasterer, a medical assistant, this term being not by chance a piece of camp slang too. He did not sign a single one of the camp chief's decrees for imprisonment in the punishment block, since he considered that even a dog shouldn't be put in such a punishment block, let alone people. The stove only warmed the jailer out in the corridor. That was all right. Incarcerations took place there without his signature. Excuse me. When, through the fault of the construction superintendent, or the foreman, or because of the absence of fencing or safety precautions, a Zec died at work, who was it if not the medical staff, the medical assistant, and the medical section that signed the certificate attesting that he had died of a heart attack? And what that meant was that everything could just be left as it was, and tomorrow others would die. Otherwise, the medical assistant would soon be working at the mine face himself. And the doctor too. When quarterly commissioning took place, that comedy of general medical examination of the camp population, with assignment to categories: heavy physical labor, average physical labor, light physical labor, and individual physical labor. There were so many good doctors who opposed the evil chief of the medical section, who was kept in his job only because he supplied columns for the heavy labor. Or the medical section was at least merciful to those willing to sacrifice a part of their own bodies in order to save the rest. Everyone knows the law, not just in the camp, or in one camp or another. Self-mutilators, self-maimers, self-incapacitors were refused all medical help. This was an administration order, but who actually refused to help? The doctors. Let's say you've blown all 4 of your fingers with a dynamite cap, and you've come to the infirmary. They give you no bandage. Drop dead, dog. And back at the Moscow-Volga Canal during the wave of universal competition, for some reason, too many cases of self-maiming suddenly appeared. And there was an immediate explanation. This was a sally of the enemy class. And was one then to treat them? Of course, much depended here on the cleverness of the Zec who had maimed himself. It was possible to do it in such a way that it could not be proved, and Bernstein scalded his hand adroitly with boiling water poured through a cloth, and thus saved his life. Another might adroitly freeze his hand by not wearing a mitten, or else urinate in his felt boots and go out into the bitter cold, but you couldn't take everything into account. Gangrene could set in, and death would follow. Sometimes there were cases of unforeseen self-incapacitation. Babbage's unhealing scurvy ulcers were diagnosed as syphilis, and there was nowhere to make a blood test. He thereupon cheerfully lied, and he said his entire family had syphilis. He was moved to the venereal disease zone of the camp, and by this means he postponed his death. Was there ever a time when the medical section excused from work all the prisoners genuinely ill on a given day? Was there ever a time when the medical section excused from work all the prisoners genuinely ill on a given day, or when it didn't drive a given number of seriously ill people out to the camp compound to work? Dr. Suleimanov refused to put Pyotr Kishkin, the hero and comedian of the Czech people, in the hospital because his diarrhea did not satisfy the norm every half hour, and it had to be bleeding. So when the column formed up to go to the work site, Kishkin sat down, running the risk of getting shot, but the convoy turned out to be more merciful than the doctor. They stopped a passing car and sent Kishkin to the hospital. People will object that the medical section was held to a strictly limited percentage of Group C inpatients and ambulatory cases. So there was an explanation in every case, but in every case there also remained a cruelty in no wise outweighed by the consideration that, on the other hand, they were doing good to someone else. And then we have to bring in here the horrible camp hospitals, like the one at Camp Number 2, Krivoshetko. A small reception room, a toilet, and a hospital room. The toilet stank and filled the hospital air, but was that the worst of it? In each hospital cot lay 2 diarrhea patients, and others were lying on the floor between cots. Those who had grown weak evacuated their cots. There were no linens or medicines. 1948-49, the hospital was run by a third-year medical student, a 58, or a political dissident himself. He was desperate, but there was nothing he could do. The hospital orderlies who were supposed to feed the patients were strong, fat young fellows. They ate the patients' food, stealing from their hospital ration. Who had put them in their cushy spots? The Godfather, no doubt. The students didn't have the strength to get rid of them or defend their patients' rations. But would any doctor have had it either? Or could it possibly be contended that the medical section in every camp was able to insist on really human nutrition? Well, at least to the extent of not having those night-blind brigades. Those nighttime brigades returning from work in the evenings in a line of the night-blind, clinging to one another. Of the night-blind returning from work in the evenings. No, if by some miracle some intervention did secure an improvement in nutrition, it would only have been the work of the work administration, so as to have strong sloggers, and certainly never the medical section. No one is blaming the physicians for all this, though their courage to resist was often weak because they were afraid of being sent to general work. But the legends about the saviors from the medical section aren't needed either. Like every brand of the camp administration, the medical section too was born of the devil and filled with the devil's blood. Well, it's really so sad. It's really hard to read. I thank you for listening. It's early where I am, so I guess I hope you have a good day.